Welcome back. We're with a very special guest at Exopolitics TV on a problem that is just beginning to come into human consciousness, at the edges, much less at the mainstream. And our guest today is Cristina Consolo, a radiation expert, founder and host of Nuked Radio, also known as Radchick. Welcome, Cristina.
Thank you for having me.
I'd like to say that Cristina has drafted probably the first one that is available anywhere online, an FAQ on the effect of Fukushima, and we have to assume nuclear testing and depleted uranium weapons radiation in the atmosphere on flying in commercial airliners. The subject of today's program will be on Fukushima radiation's impact on commercial airline passengers. What will happen to you? What could happen to you when you fly? And that FAQ is available at ecologynews.com. We'll put the link in the video description. It's a 25-page FAQ, and it's the leading edge of what's available because this information has, we believe, accidentally on purpose not been put together, and as we will learn, there's a great deal of intentional avoidance by the various governmental agencies, responsible governmental agencies in this area. First of all, just to get kind of a base level, Cristina, going to this first section in the FAQ, has the FAA issued, say, limits on what radiation exposure should be during during airplane flights, for passengers and for crew and pilots?
I don't know that the FAA has a per flight recommendation. I know that based on a study that was done in the year 2000, it showed that the yearly exposure rates for personnel who worked as pilots and stewardesses and so forth was to not exceed 20 millisieverts per year.
And so 20 millisieverts are 20,000 microsieverts.
Correct.
Okay.
And the company Medcom that makes the Inspector Geiger counter has a statement in its informational brochure that comes with the Geiger stating that normal levels of radiation in flight should be about 200 CPMs or 200 counts per minute at 30,000 feet of altitude.
So roughly speaking, taking the kind of rough thing that the ratio to microsieverts is about 100 to 1, that's about 2 microsieverts. Right?
Right. We've had a number of people who have taken readings during flights, and some of them you listed also in the FAQ with their measurements, and they were most of them were lower than what I had measured on a trip from Charlotte, North Carolina to Cancun, Mexico in April of 2013. I hit a high note of 1,400 CPMs, counts per minute, during the flight, and it actually stayed up that high for several hours. Coming back a week later, I hit about half of that. So there was nothing going on at the time in terms of sun activity that could have contributed to that. Sometimes we have gamma that comes from celestial sources, like our star that can cause the radiation levels to be up higher, especially if we have a coronal mass ejection, a CME that's incoming. But there was nothing like that going on. And I had some pretty severe health problems following that flight, as well as one of my kids that were also on the trip.
Right. So that during that there's so much information packed into there, but basically from flying, especially on the leg from Charlotte, North Carolina to Cancun, you experience 200 counts per minute, or in other words, 2 microsieverts per hour. Is that correct?
I was experiencing 1,400 counts per minute.
Oh, 1,400, right. Sorry. Yeah.
Oh, the Gulf of Mexico.
1,400. Got it. The normal should be 200. So you were experiencing 7 times the normal.
Right.
And so what happened to you and what happened to your daughter?
Well, pretty much from the time I landed, I had a problem with swelling in my extremities, and I've never had anything like that happen before. And by the 3rd day, it was so severe that I had to be hospitalized, and I had to have IVs. I had a massive kidney infection that caused the kidney failure. The people at the hotel, though, at first they had me see a physician who worked for the hotel we were staying at. She thought I was in cardiac failure, acute cardiac failure and distress, because by that time I was actually getting heart palpitations because my heart was really straining with all of this added fluid in my system. And the rest of the trip I ended up, being on bed rest. And I got to see what it was like to be in a Mexican hospital, which was an interesting experience. But about 2 weeks after we returned, my oldest daughter, who's 28 and in perfect health, had the exact same thing happen to her. So it was a little concerning that both of us on the same trip come down with the same affliction, where we've never had a history of that before. And there were a number of other students that were on the trip with us, because it was a spring break organized event through our school, that had other various ailments, swollen eyes and skin issues and so forth, that they had to seek treatment for also from the hotel physician during that time. And I don't know if that was also related, but I did notice on several of the airline workers that were on the flight that were, serving us, that they had some pretty significant skin issues going on too, which I was even surprised they were working with how severe they were. Just very, very dry, cracked, bleeding skin on their face, around, the corners of their mouth, corners of their eyes. And I don't know if they're frequently flying that route and they're being exposed to those kinds of levels all the time.
And are these symptoms related to low to radiation exposure? Are these the type of symptoms that are related to radiation exposure, so that you could say that these high levels of radiation that you measured in your Geiger counter resulted in these symptoms being experienced by yourself and your daughter and the fellow students and the crew?
They certainly could be. I mean, they're on the list of known effects from radiation exposure. But, people are going to be affected in different ways depending on their overall health, the how well their immune system functions,
right,
how often they're exposed to these levels, or what they've been exposed to in their life previously. Like if they fly a lot, either for business or pleasure, if they're doing long distance flights, transatlantic, transpacific flights, how many medical tests that they've done. All of this is important information to calculate exactly how much radiation you've had over your lifetime or within the last year or within the last 10 years. And there are actually tables online where you can go and you can calculate that and put in how often you fly, how many hours, how many tests you've had done, how many CAT scans, x-rays, and it will give you an idea of what you've been exposed to in a certain amount of time. And that includes, dental x-rays too.
Sure. Now, going back to the original issue that we were talking about, the occupational limits of radiation that were recommended by the ICRP and the FAA, it was 20,000 microsieverts per year. The ICRP also recommends the radiation limit during pregnancy to be 1,000 microsieverts per year, 1/20th of that.
Mm-hmm.
That's a significantly low, that's a pretty low threshold compared to 20,000.
Right. In the developing embryo, though, we know that an embryo will be exposed or have effects that are 1,000 times greater than an adult because all of the cell division that's going on with that embryo.
So if there had been a pregnant woman, which there may have been, I don't know, you were on the flight, on that flight, and looking at the symptoms that you and your daughter developed, we could just look at what may have happened to the pregnant woman, to the embryo in the pregnant woman. Do you have any comment on that?
Mm-hmm. I don't really believe that it's ever safe to fly during pregnancy, even before Fukushima, because of the added risk to embryonic damage. If you're in the first trimester of the pregnancy, the first 12 weeks, your basic neural tubes, the eyes are developing, the eyes actually grow out of the same type of tissue that forms the brain and the spine. And then in the second trimester, you have organogenesis, where the organs are developing. And in the third trimester, your brain is developing, a baby's brain. So depending on what part of pregnancy a woman would be in, you might see health effects associated from exposure that she received. And that's known data. Most good OBGYNs warn their patients not to fly or limit their flying during pregnancy.
Right. And we've all seen those photographs of babies born with birth defects in Fallujah from the elevated radiation levels from depleted uranium weapons, where you could call them, they're almost monster-like. It's a war crime. You would think that the FAA or the IATA or the ICRP would be making public health announcements about the dangers of pregnant women flying currently.
You would think so if they actually cared about public health. But I think they care more about keeping the industry going. And that may have played a part in the early decision in the first few days and weeks after the reactors exploded at Fukushima, that there were discussions that were going on. It's right in the NRC Freedom of Information Act transcripts that they were considering grounding flights. They did ground flights in and out of Tokyo for a period of time, but they were considering grounding flights throughout the Northern Hemisphere. And that it was discussed by the NRC, and there's no further discussion or summation of why they came to the decision to allow planes to keep flying and to continue flying under the circumstances that we have now, or if we have another major event occur at Fukushima.
Would that have been a decision that would have been taken at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission level or the FAA level or the presidential level? Do you know?
I don't know. I would assume that it would include parties from all three, but I really don't know.
Okay. So now let's look at the fact that on the flight down, you were exposed to 7 times the normal level of radiation was 1400 CPM, 14 microsieverts per hour. And on the flight back, it was quite different. So there are these differences. And let's just hold that for a second, because we're going to address that question. But let's just hold that question here and get some more data on the table.
Okay.
I just want to put out 2 bits of data and then another one so that we have 4 readings. And the thing about the 4 readings is that they're wildly different. 2 of the readings, including your own, are in one quadrant, and 2 of the readings are in a different quadrant. And we're going to ask the question, why? We have readings from Connie Fogel, who's a former Vancouver, British Columbia Parks Board Commissioner, and she submitted readings on round-trip flights from Vancouver, BC to Heathrow, UK in January of 2014. And on the flight over, the average was 2.45 microsieverts, which is about a little over the normal. And on flight back, it was 2.89 to 3.60 microsieverts per hour. And we also have data from Tom Clearwater, who's a lawyer here in Vancouver, BC. And he flew from Vancouver, BC to Hong Kong and then on to Johannesburg, South Africa. And he reports flying almost directly over Fukushima, and the highest that he got was west of Alaska of 2.20 microsieverts. Over Japan, he got 1.53, and this is 1.30, flying directly over Fukushima. And he got 50% lower than that, flying from Hong Kong to Johannesburg. Then I'd like to just add for the mix a flight that's been reported by rents.com. All of this data we're just reading from the FAQ, which is at ecologynews.com. And so the listeners can go to ecologynews.com and just click on the link there and look at the 25-page FAQ and follow it as we're talking about it here. And I recommend that you do, because this is the only FAQ on the planet on this subject at this moment, February 20th, 2014. We hope that there will be many more. And this flight was July 1st, 2013, from Chile in South America to Portland, Oregon. And they had the high reading there was 1,208 counts per minute. That's close up to your 1,400. In other words, 12.08 microsieverts, and that's over Oregon on the American West Coast. So why is it that we're finding such differences? For example, we have 2 flights, yours from North Carolina to Cancun, Mexico, and this one from Chile to Oregon, where we have very high readings on those 2 flights. And then we have 2 other flights, one over the Atlantic and the other over the Pacific from Vancouver to Hong Kong. And they are, just within a normal range. What's your theory as to why we have such variation?
Well, first of all, I think it's wonderful that people are taking the time to take these measurements during trips and share them publicly, and we need a lot more people doing that. Except I've had some recent emails from one person in particular who's a physician who was flying out of Philadelphia recently, who had his Geiger confiscated by the TSA. So I don't know if they're still allowing Geigers to be taken on flights, And I wouldn't be surprised if they discourage the use of them, especially when we're coming up with numbers like this. But your question about why the discrepancy, why the differences, each one of these readings, each one of these trips are really just like a poll. It's a snapshot in time of what's happening on a certain, very small area of the planet. And the radiation that we have that is traveling around the globe, and it's been monitored by universities in Japan. This plume has been circling the Earth about every 40 days. And this came from information that was published about a year and a half ago, too, so I don't know how that plume has changed in its configuration. But we do follow fallout readings and weather patterns on about 2 or 3 times a week on my website, Climate Viewer. And it's very easy to see where these fallout events occur based on storms and where the tropopause is, where the most dynamic situation is occurring in the atmosphere. That's where we see a lot of fallout that is landing on the ground and being picked up by people with detectors. As far as what it's doing up in the air, we know that they have a tendency to stick together because of their electrical charge. The same thing is being found with the ocean plume as the air plume. And unless you have a monitor, a very expensive monitor on every single airplane that's flying, we have really no way to track this. I mean, we can see when it might be risky to fly to a certain area based on what's happening storm-wise or according to the tropopause. But, once you're above the cloud layer, as far as monitoring that, I would think if there was some satellites that are doing that, that information would be shared. I have heard that from Loren that they have changed some of the routes at times.
This is Loren Murray.
Loren Murray.
Yeah, independent
that they have changed, and she has been recommending to her friends if they have to fly across the Pacific to do so on the southernmost route possible. And so it's very difficult to say. It's kind of a hit or miss thing. You really don't know what you're going to get hit with when you're up there. But the fact that there's plutonium that's in the atmosphere, not only from Fukushima, but from weapons testing, makes it a gamble to fly really anytime with your health, because you don't know how it's going to affect you either.
Now, so really what you're saying is that in the same way that we have fluid dynamic laws that determine how the distribution of the Fukushima and other radioactivity is happening within the ocean currents, and it's driving it across the Pacific and perhaps into other areas. In the same way, in the atmosphere, we have fluid dynamics laws which are governing the distribution of the radiation in the atmosphere. It's not that the atmosphere is a soup in which the radiation is evenly distributed. It's very much bunched up, and it's going in different patterns. So when you go up in an individual flight, it's really a chance whether you're going to run into a batch of high radiation or not. Is that what you're saying?
Right. And if you think, have you ever been to the website Flight Tracker, where you can see all of the planes that are in the air at the same time? If each one of those planes had a monitor that the information was then downloaded to a website where we could view it in real time, like we do with Radiation Network or NetC, where they're importing ground data from the EPA and from people who have Geiger counters, we would need to have the same kind of program for the skies to determine where these plumes are, and then see how they relate to the behavior of weather, and planes would have to be adjusted accordingly to help avoid those areas, and not even so much for the people that are flying on the plane, but the pilots who are flying 80 hours a month and the flight crews, they average 75 to 85 hours a month. Their continued exposure, if they're flying through these levels, is going, and it may be manifesting itself with some of these cases that we're going to be talking about of pilots that have been passing out and crew members having problems. And there's actually a lawsuit going on now about an issue with almost 3,000 flight attendants who were having problems from Alaskan Air. And we'll talk about that too.
Great. Now, but just sticking with the radiation in the air for a second, you also say that there's different types of radiation in the atmosphere which can affect you differently, and it depends upon the type of particles that you're running into. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
Could you talk about that?
Yeah, and I had the best intentions when I went on this trip. I knew that it could possibly affect my health, and I was having health issues already. And I wore a mask on the plane for the early part of the flight. And when I started getting these high readings, there's certain tests that you can do with the Geiger counter where you block the pancake probe using paper or aluminum foil or a book and so forth, and you can try to determine if it's alpha particles or beta or gamma. And it appeared at the time, because the numbers didn't change no matter what I blocked the instrument with, that it was all either a beta or gamma source. So I wasn't concerned about alpha particles at the time, and I took the mask off for the rest of the flight. And I wish I would have left it on. Because I've had reports from people who have worn masks during the flight, and when they have landed and they have checked the background of the area where they are and then checked the mask, they're getting high readings off the mask they wore, which is indicating that there may be particles lodged in that mask. So that was my mistake, and the reason for the concern. And if you try to figure in a math problem, how badly did you get exposed? How many hours could you fly with this type of exposure? There's so many different variables to the problem, but the really big one is if there's alpha particles involved, because those are going to be 20 times stronger than beta or gamma. And so that changes the equation considerably. And if we know that we already have plutonium in our atmosphere from Fukushima, we've had it actually since weapons testing, but in this case from Fukushima, then you can't do any math that says that it's safe to fly at all. No matter how good our intentions are to want to explain this to people, and I hate to say that, but it's just devastating for people who have to fly a lot for work, or maybe just to keep in touch with family, or even, some who have spouses working in different cities and they have to fly to see each other because of the economy being so bad. This is devastating to hear this kind of information. And in order to really get a handle on this, we need to be talking about this, and we need to be sharing our readings. We need a lot more data from people who are flying or can tell us, what's happened to them after a flight. But we've kind of known all along, because of knowing what is up in the atmosphere and seeing that some pilots were coming down with problems, and air flight crews were having problems, that this situation will get worse with time. And that's exactly what we're seeing when we put all of this data together. And
the reason why we are gathering all of this data at the citizen level is that the government is withholding all the data. Is that correct?
Right. In every aspect of this disaster. The ocean releases, what's happening on the beaches with the incoming tsunami debris. They even suggested to people in Hawaii, to boat captains, to take radiation measurements a year and a half ago in Hawaii because they wanted to track any plumes that were incoming. They've never shared any of that data. It was done on a completely hushed up basis. We're just finding out about that now. So they know that there is a problem. They're tracking everything and probably know exactly where things are and where the worst of it is, but that is not being shared with the public at large, because you can't have people not traveling to the West Coast, not eating sushi, and not flying. That would be devastating to our economy, which is in a bad enough position as it is.
Now, let's begin to get more deeply into the data that you've gathered. And again, I really urge people who are watching this, just go to ecologynews.com or go to the video description, and the link to the FAQ is there, and you just go there and be taken to this data so that you'll be able to read for yourself, because Fukushima is an area where you've got to read the data and decide for yourself, because the impact of this is entirely personal, as Christina has said. Let's jump, Christina, to the area of airline sickness reports and sudden heart attacks. And you always say that you like to do the following methodology. And the methodology is, let's look at the cases from before Fukushima and what happens after Fukushima. So could you walk us through the airline sickness reports and the sudden heart attacks, both of crew and passengers, from before Fukushima and from after Fukushima?
Sure, and I would like to also explain how I learned about that, and it was from having a conversation with Dr. Timothy Massot, who's the Chernobyl mutation expert. I had contacted him about 4 or 5 months ago and was talking to him about the images that I had collected so far from the mutations post-Fukushima, and how can I get these mutations tested. And what he had told me, and he has written hundreds of studies on mutations that have occurred after Chernobyl. He travels to Chernobyl frequently. He's done studies for the DOE, the DOD. He said he can't even get access to those machines right now. Even with all of the work that he's done for the government, they have shut down access to any kind of testing for people who are trying to figure out what's going on. And he explained to me, and this was for the mutations, but it really applies to whatever you are looking at post-Fukushima, is go back and see what you can find prior to, is go back as far as you can, get a good sampling, and that will give you an idea, whether you're using Google or Wayback Machine or, botany websites, look at what has been found out in nature previously. And, the testimonials from people are very important too. People who have, had the same kind of, trees and so forth growing or produce growing for decades are seeing things that they've never seen happen before. And those kinds of things are really important in the absence of really hard data, which we can only get if we have access to the kind of machines that the EPA has, which we don't. So and we were talking about the mutations, of course, but this applies also to this airline situation. And so when I started compiling this list, Loren and I had talked about this briefly during a interview that we did about a year ago. There were a couple of pilots that had heart attacks within a few weeks of each other, had passed out during flights in the Pacific Northwest within weeks of each other. So it was a mainstream news story. And so I started looking through Google and using Wayback and so forth, and I knew that it had to have happened before, but it was very difficult to find any of these instances. So what I ended up doing is going to a pilots forum, and it's called airliners.net, and I found only 2 cases in their database. One was of a Northwest Airlines pilot that passed out in January of 2004, and one was a Porter's Airline pilot that passed out in November of 2009. And then I found a couple other mentions, one from 85, one where a passenger who had flown a plane once but wasn't certified, was able to bring a Cessna safely to the ground in Lansing, Michigan after the pilot suffered a heart attack. That was 1985. 2009, twin engine turboprop had the pilot who died early into the flight. And there was a total of 6 documented cases of pilots passing out while flying the plane since 2004, prior to 311. So, trying to search through the NTSB, they do not keep records.
So, and it's just to jump in, 311 means Fukushima because Fukushima occurred on 3/11/11, March 11th, 2011. That's just for the viewers who may be joining us for the first time.
Mm-hmm. So we couldn't use the NTSB website because they don't keep track of this kind of data of pilots having medical emergencies. So in comparing the news stories, which are now showing up in searches, and sometimes you have to go to specific countries to search for these reports, we've had a sizable increase in these events. This list, we've also included the pilots passing out, having heart attacks, crews having health issues, and planes that are landing at wrong airports. And the reason for that is I have a very close friend who, actually my neighbor, who used to be an engineer for Lockheed Martin, and I had talked to him about this when it first happened. And I said, how does a pilot land at the wrong airport? As this has happened, it happened like twice in 2 weeks. And he said they had to have become really confused in the cockpit. I mean, it's almost impossible unless you willfully ignore your computer systems to land at the wrong airport. And then in searching, I found that this has actually happened a few times also with military planes. So the first case that I found was April of 2011, flying from California to Colorado. A wife had to take over flying when her pilot husband passed out. He had started having trouble breathing and speaking on this flight, and ground controllers in Colorado actually sent up another plane to help guide the craft because she had no flying experience. And in June of 2011 in Australia, there was an Emirates, I don't know if I'm saying that right, Emirates Air.
Emirates.
Mm-hmm. Pilot who passed out for 55 minutes during a flight and woke up. He was unconscious at the controls as he flew over Adelaide, Australia, and out to sea. September of 2011 in Reno, Nevada, we had a pilot that passed out during an air show, causing a crash which killed 11 people and injured 60. Air show instances, I included 2 because there were 2 major ones since 3/11, but I'm not convinced that that is a rad situation. And from reading the reports of the extensive accident reconstruction, it appeared that those might be G-force related issues that caused the pilots to pass out. But it's something we need to keep an eye on to see if it happens more frequently as well. We had a case in October of 2011 where British actor Mr. Bean had to fly the plane he was in when his pilot passed out. He actually had his wife and children on board with him. They were flying at 16,000 feet over Kenya. And he had taken over the controls for about 20 minutes before they could revive the pilot, which they did, and he was able to land the plane. In January of 2012 in Great Britain, and this was probably one of the worst reports. This could have been a major airline accident. A severe medical emergency during flight occurred when both pilots passed out and a plane lost altitude sharply. British Airways jet was forced to make an emergency landing after 2 women pilots almost passed out at the controls. They were so out of it that they were unable to fly the plane. They were still conscious, They sent out a call for a senior member of the cabin crew to come to the aid of the flight crew, and what was found out later that just the lightheaded, dizzy, and unwell feeling at the time had caused them to lose control of a packed commuter plane. And there were a number of testimonials from people that were on this flight too of how far this plane dropped during this series of events. In April of 2012 in Wisconsin, an 80-year-old woman had to land the plane after her pilot husband also passed out. Her name is Helen Collins. Also in April of 2012, Air Canada had to cancel 70 flights due to a pilot shortage and possible illegal sick out. And that's something else that I'm keeping track of, because I'm not sure if the pilots are aware of this situation. I know that some of them are, because I have heard from some people in the industry that have indicated that they are aware that they may be exposed to significant levels of radiation during flight from Fukushima. In May of 2012, ABC News had reported 100 flight crew members that had to take sick leave. According to Seattle King 5 News, they determined that this may have been from a chemical that was used to clean the flight attendants' uniforms. But what was really concerning about this is that many of these flight crew members were having thyroid issues. And I am not aware of any chemicals that can cause that. And also, some of the symptoms they were having were severe rashes, hair loss, bleeding issues, bloody noses, and then thyroid problems too, and just a general unwell feeling. In May of 2012, there was another large sick out staged by Air India, causing 100 flights to be canceled. And it was around this time in July of 2012 that we started seeing some mainstream reports come out of how to fly a plane if your pilot passes out. The first one appeared in Wired magazine in the UK, following this British jet that lost altitude. And then this story is very interesting. There was a study that ended up being done by the Pentagon to try to figure out why F-22 pilots had passed out 11 times in the past year, which was absolutely unheard of for people who fly this type of plane. The direct quote was, "What gave the Air Force grave concern last year was the unexplained nature of the incidents and the incident rates," said Major General Charles Lyon, Director of Operations for Air Combat Command, who headed the investigation. "At one point, we got up to 11 incidents, which we could not explain. This was a grave concern for pilots as well." In May, 2 F-22 pilots went public on CBS saying they refused to fly planes after becoming woozy and dizzy in mid-flight. The problem, after this Pentagon study, was determined to be pressurized vests that the pilots wear when they fly. July 2012, Tampa.
Did you find anything in the F-22 case where there would be a radiation connection? Or do you think that this vest problem was a cover story, or what?
I think it's something that needs further watching.
Further watching, okay.
Yeah. In July of 2012 in Tampa, there was a C-17 that landed at the wrong airport. In September of 2012, there was a large number of pilots calling in sick, canceling 300 flights, also attributed to contract worries.
Now, I'd just like to interject there that I've spoken to a stewardess based in New York who says that they are worried about this issue, air flight attendants, and that it's all between the crew, because the unions are are blocking this information about radiation.
Mm-hmm. And the unions are really the ones who should be taking charge.
Exactly. So there's a lot of underground. So this is just an anecdote that I'm saying that the sick-ins, these are actions that may have radiation connections to them that we don't know yet, because all of this is still inside the underground, inside the airline pilots and attendants culture.
Right. There was a related article that came out in the Dallas News Aviation blog in September of 2012, following this large number of pilots that had called in sick. And American Airlines spokesman Bruce Hicks said in a carrier statement that sick leave has been up more than 20% year over year, and it had been elevated for months prior to the sick out event. And then in November of 2012, we had another pilot that passed out, had stroke-like symptoms. It wasn't released for a couple weeks, but it was before a Kuwait-bound Abu Dhabi flight was due to land. The 44-year-old pilot suddenly was unable to speak properly and had difficulty breathing. Before coming unconscious mid-flight, the co-pilot took over and declared an emergency and was able to do a successful landing. Now, we're not even really halfway through these stories, and we are already, we're up to November of 2012. Things
So we could go on for a long time just looking at the time of the program. I think that you've established this pattern of before Fukushima, 6 cases, and now after Fukushima, it's becoming a pattern. Mm-hmm. So I think that we can begin to go to other areas and ask the readers to go directly to the FAQ at ecologynews.com and begin to read all the many cases that you have brought together for the first time now publicly going online. Where the government has really, and the mainstream media has, although paradoxically these are from the mainstream media, they are not presented in their true public health context, and that is as that there's reasonable cause to believe that all of this is triggered by Fukushima radiation. So let's just, I'm scrolling down here and go to radiation affecting brain function, where we have unruly passenger study, a huge increase in unruly passengers.
Yes, and I have somebody who is trying to find every single story before and after 3/11, so that we can also quantify those reports. There's so many of those reports, including pilots who have to be restrained because they're acting inappropriately. And, in some cases, there's alcohol that's involved, sure. And some of these are also celebrities that have been unruly on planes or had disembarked from planes looking, much worse for wear than when they got on. These are all things. It's really hard to, as one or two or three people, to try to track all the events, but we do need to get more data and try to start looking closer at these timelines and sharing them with other people so we can get a handle on this, and people can make the decision of whether or not they want to risk exposing themselves or their children to these rads during flights.
So what you're saying here, though, is that there's been a dramatic increase in unruly passenger reports, and that there may be this is where the aircraft may have gone through these patches of radiation, including the alpha particles, and that may have affected brain function, and that may be why these passengers are becoming unruly. That's how that affects that person's particular organism. Is that kind of the thinking here?
Yes, radiation affects the executive part of the brain, which is the part of the brain that keeps you from doing really crazy things.
You know, very succinctly said, and that's very clear. Very clear. Well, let's go to the next section, which is aircraft air circulation. And walk us through that.
Oh, okay, yes. These were specs that were provided by Donaldson Aircraft. Half of the air that circulates during flights is pulled from the outside, and half is recirculated. The air that is recirculated inside of the plane is passing through HEPA filters. But the air that is coming from the outside is not being filtered. About HEPA filters, a high efficiency particulate absorption, or HEPA, is a type of air filter. They have many applications in medical facilities, automobiles, aircraft, and homes. The filter has to satisfy certain standards of efficiency, and it is 99.97% efficient in filtering particles that have a size of 0.3 microns or larger.
So what you're saying is that this shows that by going up in an airplane, you're actually drawing in radiation from the atmosphere.
Yeah, and I was under the impression that all of the air was filtered in these flights that's coming in from outside, but it's not. It's only being filtered once it gets in the plane, and only 50% of it is the recirculated air. The other 50% keeps coming from the outside of the plane. So, at some point you have to wonder if these airlines are going to be contaminated on the inside of the plane. I had noticed when we were flying and I was getting these extraordinarily high readings that the numbers are much higher towards the bottom of the plane, like at the ground level, at your feet, than they are up by where you sit or where you have your table fold out, which I don't really know what to account for that. But yeah, they're drawing in outside air, and that was part of the reason why early in the crisis, Europe and Asian flights were all halted going into Tokyo, so they wouldn't expose their passengers, although they did. In fact, they picked up passengers that landed in the U.S. that had particulate contamination, although we don't know what kind of particles they were contaminated with. We know that commercial air carriers were trying to make a decision whether or not to ground flights per the NRC conversations. One in particular came from Mr. Castro, who said that, yes, it's a significant amount of people, and they have authorized all Americans to go on the charter. They've taken half the flights and have embassy dependents. Well, no, each flight, I don't know how to say it, now I'm starting to get tired. Each flight is reserved, half reserved for embassy dependents. The other half for the flight is for American citizens. And the male participant, who has not been identified in this conversation, says, okay, so they're pumping those, but they're worried because, they may get grounded eventually because of, radiation. They are worried about the radiation. Commercial air carriers are trying to make the decision whether they are going to stop their flights. And if they do, then that puts more pressure on the charter flights to get people out. In a follow-up phone call to the NRC, on day 7 of the accident, a participant who's not identified by name says the Japanese had asked the NRC, how do we deal with extending doses or allowing workers to soak up higher amounts of radiation in an emergency? We just told them for emergencies in a condition like this that we have guidelines that let us go to a certain limit. But in this case, you need to do what you need to do to get it done. And that's exactly what they said during their phone calls. Speaking from Tokyo, Charles Castro, the deputy administrator for the NRC region that covers the western United States, also said he predicted that rising levels of radioactivity might stop airliners from coming into Tokyo, and remarked on his own tiredness and rambled, when you've got 1,000 dead bodies washing up on the shore, you know, it's these people, I don't know, I mean, you know, I think we need to be prepared for it, but it's going to be tough for them, and we're over here barking at them. It's good. The president's calling for an assessment of the safety in this country, and I'm not exactly sure what that means yet, but I think we will have an opportunity to shape it. And that probably has a lot to do why this isn't being talked about.
Right. Now, we'll get to the why question at the end of all of this. Let's get to the helicopters and explain to us what a helicopter radiation flight is.
Helicopter radiation flights are usually conducted by the Department of Energy, the Department of Homeland Security, or the National Nuclear Security Administration, or NNSA. And what they do is they do a survey that's usually about 300 feet off ground, where they will fly over neighborhoods where they suspect contamination exists, and they'll do a survey and record the numbers that they get during this flight. Now, they've done this for years. They know what the background levels are across the entire country. It's supposed to be done in the event of a terrorist act, or suspicion of a terrorist device or a nuclear bomb that's being hidden in a city, or contamination from a nuclear accident. And that was another one of the things that I had noticed a lot in the news, and had also had a lot of emails about from people, is helicopters flying around their house, very low to the ground, doing passes, going back and forth, where you can tell that they're doing some kind of survey, and it didn't appear that they were spraying anything. Prior to 3/11, and I have to find it in my notes here. I could only find 2 postings of these flights being conducted, because they usually warn people ahead of time in the news, so the police department doesn't get a bunch of calls asking, why are there low-flying helicopters over my house? I found one event in 2006 and one in 2009. Since Fukushima, since 3/11, I believe there's been 14 or 15 that I could actually find documentation about, that it was posted ahead of time for people who lived in the area. And the areas include, I won't read through the whole list, Seattle in July of 2011, another one near Seattle in 2011, New York, Los Angeles, and Atlanta, although those were posted in a Seattle article. November 11th in Las Vegas, May of 2012 in Baltimore, August of 2012 in the San Francisco Bay Area, August of 2012 in Berkeley, January 2013 in DC. In fact, they spent 2 weeks testing DC, where everywhere else they spend 4 or 5 days, which I thought was interesting. January of 2013, New Orleans. December of 2013, that was a program that was released for Detection Halo. The city of Los Angeles has received an $11.4 million grant to create what they call a detection halo that would provide an early warning of impending doom. The program, administered by the Domestic Nuclear Detection Office, utilizes sensor equipment, communications infrastructure, and special training to attain what some skeptics think is unattainable security in an insecure world. Why they're only doing this in Los Angeles is interesting. January of 2014, Baltimore again, and then in preparation for the Super Bowl flights, they flew these radiation helicopters also in New Jersey and New York just prior to the event.
Now, what you say is that none of the results of any of these missions has been released to the public.
No, they have not.
Have there been any Freedom of Information requests filed for that data, or is that
not that I'm aware of? But I would imagine that they will put this under the umbrella of national security.
So therefore, it would be exempt. Now, for the final area of data, and I know this is an area that you and independent scientist Loren Murray, who's done pioneering work in Fukushima, you and she have really brought this area to the forefront. And so this is the Celebrity Sickness and Cancer Death List. And it sounds rather macabre, but there's a reasoning to it, is that celebrities travel by airliner frequently and therefore would be exposed to atmospheric radiation and the perils of airliner travel more than the normal public. Is that sort of the reasoning there?
Yes, and most of them live in California,
which is on the West Coast, which is part of the impact zone of both the ocean plume and the atmospheric plume traveling across.
And then if they live in LA near Simi Valley, then they've been exposed to 3 nuclear meltdowns at the Rocketdyne facility.
I see. What exactly is? Yeah. What's the Rocketdyne facility?
Rocketdyne, and now it was bought out by Boeing. It's the Simi Valley Santa Susana Lab.
Oh.
And there's been 3 meltdowns there.
Okay.
In the past.
Yeah. So.
And enormous cancer rates, rare brain tumors, retinoblastomas in children. In fact, Aaron Brockovich is representing, I believe, 10 families who all have young kids with brain tumors that live right next door to this facility now. But that area's been pretty heavily contaminated. So the celebrities are in a high-risk group, not only because of where they live, but because of the amount of flying that they do.
That they do. Okay. Now, you and Loren Murray did an original interview. Could you talk about the cases, the celebrities, sickness and cancer death list that you examined then?
Sure, and I had contacted Loren originally and said, I'm just noticing a lot of these people are sick, and my daughters had mentioned to me too that they've seen these strange reports, and this was prior to when we put the interview together, and she said she had been collecting them as well. And so we put our list together and we came up with 10. We had 10 people that are all fairly well known. One was Kim Kardashian, who was doing an extraordinary amount of flying while pregnant. And then later, after the interview, she delivered her baby 5 or 6 weeks early because she went into liver failure. Jessica Alba, who had symptoms of a stroke. Dwayne Michael Carter, also known as Little Wayne, who suffered a series of seizures while he was flying. Kelly Osbourne, who suffered a seizure while she was taping a show. Gwyneth Paltrow, she had numerous health issues. Shortly after Fukushima happened, she was living in England at the time, and she had symptoms of a stroke, and she had a severe miscarriage, and she had a lot of stuff going on. Justin Bieber, who had been acting out in almost every city where he flew to do a concert, and that continues. Morrissey, who's a singer from the UK, and Brooke Burke, who was a woman who hosts a lot of these award shows. She had her thyroid removed. So that was the original list.
That's very interesting, because no one has pointed out Justin Bieber's acting out as being caused by Fukushima radiation. This is the first. I think. And I think it was just announced yesterday that because of the legal problems, he might be kind of taking a break from public action.
Yeah.
But anyway, I find that remarkable. Okay. All our compassion to him for being irradiated without his knowledge, and if it's true, for having his brain function severely altered so that he's, what do they say? Forgive them, for they know not what they do. Now, what are the new cases that you have found of celebrity sickness, cancer, heart attack, stroke in the past 11 months that are possibly radiation related? And where you have, including significant hair loss, bald spots that are reported with photo documentation.
Yeah, this is just the list that I've compiled since Loren and I did that original Nuked in the Skies interview. She also has a list that includes many people that I'm not even going to mention here. And I have to give credit to my daughters, too, because they've picked up a lot of these stories on Twitter, because it's people that they follow or have in their Twitter feeds. I grouped them by really symptomology, because there's so many. I think my list, I have 30 or 40 new ones just in the past year since we did that original report. But I'll go through this quickly. Significant hair loss and bald spots that have actually been reported about in gossip magazines with photos: Paris Hilton, Khloe Kardashian, Kristen Stewart. Illnesses that occurred during long flights that required a hospital visit when landing: Selena Gomez, Rita Ora, Jennifer Lawrence. And then 3 celebrities that continuously get put on the gaunt list, which might just be from eating disorders or what have you, I don't know. Denise Richards, Angelina Jolie, and Nicole Richie. And my youngest daughter had found a picture recently on Twitter from Denise Richards where she's getting a vitamin C IV in the doctor office to help her immune system.
So these are frequent flyers.
These are frequent flyers, and there's a couple others, and these are usually wives of people that are somewhat famous. Bodie Miller, who's an Olympic skier, his wife had a late-term miscarriage recently. Jack Osbourne, whose sister, Kelly Osbourne, we talked about in our first show, his wife had a late-term miscarriage as well. I believe she was within 2 weeks of delivering. And another one that I don't have on here, but that just happened within the last week, a girl who is the daughter of Lorenzo Lamas, who is also a reality show star, suffered a significant uterine bleeding event. It was actually bleeding outside of her uterus at her 16-week point in her pregnancy. And she was hospitalized as she passed out and went into a coma, and she lost the baby. That was just within the last week or so that happened. All of these people that we've talked about so far live in California with the exception of Angelina Jolie. Thyroid problems. Jet Li, who is a martial arts star, I believe, actor. Charlize Theron had appeared at numerous public appearances with what appears to be a thyroidectomy scar, although her publicist said that it was for a back injury she received about 10 years ago. Brooke Burke, who we covered on the previous interview. Skin cancer has just been out of control in California lately. Bruce Jenner had several surgeries for skin cancer on his face. Hugh Jackman had skin cancer removed recently, and Vinnie Jones and his wife both had surgery for skin cancer too. Those are all within the last 3 months.
And these are frequent flyers. I just want to try and make the connection to the atmospheric radiation patches that one might encounter during flight.
Yeah, we have a separate list going too, although it's not my favorite list to go through, is all the sports people. The NFL players, coaches. We've had a number of coaches that have passed out or had heart attacks during a game while they're running up and down the sidelines. A number of players that have passed out, and some interesting events where they're at high school football games where not only players are passing out and having health issues during the game, but people in the stands. And there was one in particular in Indianapolis that occurred about 2 months ago. And it's just a very strange story. That's a completely separate list. We have a few politicians, John Bryson, the Commerce Secretary, who had a seizure while driving his car, and he crashed his car, and the same thing happened to Kerry Kennedy. Musicians who travel a lot for singing engagements and tours. We actually had a member of the band Blues Traveler who contacted Bill Fox after our last interview on Twitter and said that they felt one of their bandmates was suffering from radiation sickness from flying. And he never did follow up with me. Bill Fox sent him my information and email, but I never heard from anybody with that group. Rick Ross, who's a rapper, had a seizure in a plane. Lord Infamous of the 3-6 Mafia died recently of a heart attack. Tone Loc, who's another rapper, had seizures while performing on stage. Chris Brown, who also seems to display many of the anger and aggression issues that Justin Bieber has, also had a stroke a seizure while flying in a plane. And another one while he was recording in a studio, and that was within the last 6 months. And then there's been a number of reality show stars, and not only are they doing work on these shows, most of them which are on the Pacific coast or in California, but they have to fly a lot to make celebrity appearances where they go to basketball games and they, do special events to promote their show. There's been a number of them. Royce Reed, who's a 34-year-old basketball wife, passed out while she was doing one of these publicity events. Jen Arnold, who is on the Littlest Couple series, has been diagnosed with a significant and severe metastatic cancer, which was attributed to a possible pregnancy that she had in the past. Loren actually has all the information on her. Sean Sasser, who was in The Real World, on The Real World show, died of a rare lung cancer. He's very young as well. Ahmad Givens on The Real Chance for Love has stage 4 colon cancer. And Brittany Haynes, who was on the show Big Brother, recently had a baby, and her baby was diagnosed with cancer within 2 months of being born. And then we have a couple of TV directors, producers, and news anchors. Jeff Pollack, who's a Hollywood producer, died while running on a California beach. Huda Rafael, a Toronto TV producer, died at age 28 because she had a huge cancerous tumor on her heart, which was actually missed by her doctors, and her family is now suing. Kamala Dumar, BBC presenter, died at age 41 of a heart attack 3 weeks ago. Anna Watera, also a BBC presenter, died at age 39 of cancer this past week. Amy Robach, who's an ABC anchor in California, has been diagnosed recently with breast cancer. And Julie Chang, who's an anchor for Good Day LA, had a brain tumor that was discovered while she was being treated for a surfing injury.
Now I can add one too that just went public last week. Tom Brokaw. He was
diagnosed with cancer.
The anchor for NBC.
Yeah.
Just went public that he was diagnosed with cancer.
Mm-hmm.
A couple of days ago.
Yeah, I have a couple other ones that I need to get a little more background on the case. Nick Cannon, someone had sent to me, who's the husband of Mariah Carey. He came down with a very severe autoimmune disorder and had to quit everything that he was doing. And this was shortly after Fukushima first happened. So I want to try to get more information. I didn't know about him when we did our first show, and someone who saw the show sent me some information. Frankie Muniz, who's 27. He was on Malcolm in the Middle. He was the cute little kid that the show was about. He's had a series of strokes. Marsha Wallace, who worked on The Simpsons, recently died of breast cancer. Nene Leakes had blood clots in her lungs. A UK celebrity named Katie Price had severe issues with pregnancy. Dr. Drew I think he has a show about rehab or addiction. He had recently came out saying he'd been treated for cancer, as well as Robin Quivers, who works on the Howard Stern show, and former Spice Girl Mel B, whose 6-year-old daughter has been hospitalized for several severe bloody noses. She also lives in California.
And they fly quite a bit.
Yeah.
The Spice people. Okay, so at the beginning of the show, we really began to refer to, because our culture, especially after World War II and the introduction of commercial flying as part of the transportation infrastructure, I got to go to LA for lunch and I'll be back tonight. It's part of business, in the corporate world. Seeing your family at Thanksgiving, going to weddings, going to school. If you live in Florida and you go and you're attending school up in Seattle, or if you live in Spain and you're attending graduate school in England, I'm thinking of actual people who that's their actual story, their actual life. Or if you going to school here in Vancouver and you're from Hong Kong, that's an actual life, an actual person. How can normal people cope with this? What do they do? What do we do?
Well, it may be somewhat of a godsend that so many companies are in trouble financially because of the economy, that a lot of them aren't making their employees fly as much as they used to. They're having them do conferences on Skype and so forth, which make lots more sense anyway.
Yeah.
And so there is that. And I have several friends that have very, very good jobs, and they fly a lot for work. And I've been so concerned about their exposure, that I've managed to talk them into just not flying at all and finding some excuse to tell their employer about why they can't. Because if you go to your employer and you say, well, I can't, there's a storm coming in and it's going to be full of rads from Fukushima and I don't want to fly, your boss is going to think you're nuts. So it's not like you can tell them that you have to, use a little bit more, be a little bit more creative about it, how you get out of that. But it makes a lot more sense to save the company money and not go on all of these trips when most of them could just be conducted on the computer like we're doing this interview now. And just try to avoid air travel unless it's absolutely necessary.
Now,
and use ground travel wherever possible.
Because it's so, I hate to use the word, it's like roulette. It's like a gamble, because you can't really say when you get on a plane what's going to happen, because you don't know what type of plume you're going to run into, correct?
Right.
And you don't know what effect that's going to have on your particular organism.
Mm-hmm.
Isn't that like basically what all of these cases show, and what your case shows in your experience?
Mm-hmm.
Like it's complete.
It affects everyone differently. So someone who was exposed to the same thing as me that doesn't already have, immune problems might have been just fine after that kind of flight and that kind of exposure. People react to it differently depending on what they've been exposed to during their lifetime. And that was something that I didn't learn until I had been researching Fukushima for a while, because I was really concerned that my health effects all seemed to start after this accident. But in talking with, especially in talking with Loren Murray, you have a whole history of exposure that you've had. And when I was a kid growing up in the 70s, we flew all the time to Spain because my dad lived in Spain. So we flew back and forth to Spain a couple times a year. And that was right after weapons testing ended, so, and I've had some weird things that have happened to my health before Fukushima that were never really explainable. And then a lot of medical tests after having some back issues and other things. So I definitely had added exposure. Those people, though, who are already in a weakened state from having those kinds of exposures in their past are more profoundly affected by what we've now been exposed to with Fukushima. And my really big concern is because our initial exposure after the accident was so significant in the plumes that passed over North America that we didn't find out about until much later. There may be a lot of people that are walking around now not aware of how they've been affected, but if we ever have another event at that plant where there's a large radiological release, because you have so many people that were hit just from Fukushima the first time, I think the mortality increase, the sickness increase, and everything, we will see much higher rates of a second time around, if and when that occurs.
Now, what would you like the government, the FAA, the National Transportation Safety Board, the equivalent in Canada and all the other countries, the IATA, what would you like them to do? Ideally, suppose as a super informed citizen, what demands would you place on them? What would you like them to do right now about airline passenger safety and Fukushima radiation? What information should they be making public? What policies should they put into effect? Should they stop all air travel internationally, as was recommended at some point?
Well, I think the first thing that they should do is they should be talking about this within their industry and figuring out how they're going to deal with it, because this problem isn't going to go away if this is indeed what it's from. We need to have dosimeters being worn by everybody that works on planes, and we would need to have very sophisticated monitoring equipment on each and every plane that will monitor what the planes are flying through. And then those need to be, correlated into reports where it can be put, up against weather patterns, the tropopause, and see exactly where these events are and adjust the flight routes accordingly. Because if these rad levels are interfering with the health of pilots, I mean, at some point they're going to start running out of pilots. because they're going to get exposed over and over and over again. And we need to get a handle on this now before this happens. I mean, just looking at the data pre and post 3/11, there's definitely a huge increase here. And in order to find out exactly what people are being exposed to, we have to have monitors on those planes that are going to be able to and narrow it down to what isotopes they are, because it's going to make a huge difference. And then, the exposure rates have to all be recalculated, and steps would have to be taken to adjust the flight routes appropriately. But I mean, getting them to admit that this is going on is going to, I don't hold out a whole lot of hope for that happening.
Yeah. I mean, at the FAA level and at the presidential level, namely Obama, who was in office when this happened, at the government of Japan level, at the European Union level, at the government of China level, even at the United Nations level, it all seems to be cover-up. I mean, right now, it seems that some governments, like the government of Hawaii, are finally putting in bills to monitor Fukushima radiation, because the citizens in Hawaii are starting to get worried because of citizen radiation monitoring reports. Isn't that the dynamic that's happening? It's all citizen driven.
In order for them to acknowledge this in the airline industry, they're going to have pilots and flight crews that start doing a little investigating on their own, and maybe buy Geiger counters and take them on the flights with them, and make their own observations, and then approach their union leaders that, hey, we have this concern, and here's our documented evidence
now
of what we need you, and it's going to need to probably come from that part of the industry. And I'm really surprised that it hasn't already.
Yeah. Now, how can people, be they pilots, be they crew, attendants, be they passengers, citizens, concerned citizens, how can they get in touch with you to get information and advice and to get this thing rolling?
I started a page, if they're on Facebook, I started a page yesterday called Airline Anomalies Post-Fukushima. And all of the items that we discussed tonight, plus some others, I posted on there yesterday. And I would like them to, visit that page, look through the reports, and send me a message if they have anything to add to that, any questions or comments, and we'll just kind of deal with it like that right now. So we find people in the industry who really want to take control of this.
So right. So go to Facebook. We'll post the link to this page, and they can contact you there, or they can contact you by your Facebook page. And we'll see how this develops. Have you been contacted by any of the celebrities that you've written about, or others in the celebrity area, or in their families, or in their management at all, that's concerned about this?
Well, I did an interview with John Trudell a few months ago, and I think you probably know who he is. He is a huge supporter of hemp, and using hemp to decontaminate all of the extensive, chemical issues that we have. And he didn't know a whole lot about the Fukushima radiation situation, even though he lives in California. And we had done the show together, and he really, that's kind of the focus now of what he does, is just using, hemp for decontamination. And that's something really that needs to be used, or farmers need to be allowed to use so they can decontaminate their soils. I mean, it sucks up everything from the ground. Anything that's contaminating the soil, hemp will pull out of the ground. It's like a huge plant filter. And in Chernobyl, they actually have a whole research center that studies hemp being used for decontamination, and then they're turning that hemp into biofuel. So he's kind of the go-to guy for that. I was contacted by Roseanne Barr, who wants to do an interview with Loren.
Oh,
and I'm hoping that they will be able to do that soon. She's done some really, really stunning interviews for RT. Very candid about her feelings about 9/11 and other things, and the bankers and what needs to be done with them. And so I can't wait for those two to get together.
Oh, good.
But I've had some suggestions about other celebrities like Martin Sheen, who's been a big DU supporter and passing legislation, and the Sundance guy, Redford.
Yeah, Robert Redford.
Maybe contacting him. But, I think people, like, there's so much that a lot of people are trying to do, and we need to really put our efforts into making more, like, quality productions.
Yeah.
And interviews like this, where we go over just months and months of collected data and laid out in a way that's easy for people to digest, and then they can follow it from now on by themselves.
Yeah. You know what I'm thinking? For example, your friend that has the problem at work. I mean, not her specifically, but I'm thinking that now people can, for example, send the links to this program and the link to the FAQ. It's a 25-page FAQ. And, if they are asked to fly someplace and they can do it by Skype, well, they just send that link and let the other person read it and say, oh, I get it,
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, it's just, we're just at the beginning of this communication in kind of the airplane era meets Fukushima. It's kind of like, okay, what's happening here? Well, we've come to the end of this segment, and we really want to thank you. Do you have any sort of final thoughts that you'd like to leave our viewers with in this area?
Well, I'm going to keep collecting these reports, and I hope that when other people see this and they go to the Facebook page, that they will also contribute information that they may know and help get this out to other people in the industry as well. I think that this is probably going to get worse as time goes on, and we suspected that would happen with the celebrity health issues too, and that's exactly what's been happening. And, all we can really do is keep trying to get this information out there, and we'll just do more interviews as more information becomes available. And, people need to kind of like take this on and do their own research too, and try. It's a very complicated subject to try to teach people. And on top of that, it's invisible. So it's almost impossible to teach it to some people. People are generally very visual. And, we're trying to do that with some of the mutation images. In fact, I just joined with Climate Viewer 3D, Climate Viewer News, and Jim Lee, who heads Climate Viewer, has put together a map for me, and I've actually mapped out all of these events that we talked about tonight. There's also going to be a mutation map, because I can't even keep up with the submissions of mutations that I'm getting from people during the growing season. Right now it's kind of quiet. I only get maybe 1 or 2 a day from things that people are finding in stores, produce that's being sold, and plants that have funny mutations just, being sold in grocery stores and florist shops. But during the grocery season, we get probably 5 or 10 a day. People will be able to go to this map and upload these images themselves. And when you see that the majority of these mutations are occurring along the West Coast, the Northern Tier, the Great Lakes, and the East Coast. And we know from all the studies that have been done during weapons testing that that's where the majority of the fallout is going to land. And we have studies that have been now made available to us from where the Fukushima fallout has landed. And so far, Salt Lake City was a big hotspot. Great Lakes was a big hotspot. When people see where the rain falls and where these mutations are occurring, I think it's going to be incontrovertible that these are happening because of Fukushima. And
right.
so we have a lot of things kind of in the works to try to help people visualize the problem.
What's the website where people can go and see what you just described?
Climate Viewer News. And they can also upload images of chemtrails in their area. There's it's all crowdsourced data. And, you know, without the help of the agencies that are supposed to be monitoring this and the unions that are supposed to be protecting their employees, it's really up to us to try to get this out there and to be absolutely correct in everything that we talk about, everything that we refer to, and show, you know, the evidence that we've collected so that other people will join us and continue to submit evidence. And, you know, within time, we'll be able to, you know, do papers, research papers on this. And I wanted to make all of these images, the mutation images in particular, available to anyone who's writing papers or doing any kind of research. They will be able to download examples of every kind of mutation that occurs in nature because they're being sent to us all the time.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, good. I really want to thank you for your work and your dedication in this area and for having spent this time with us and with our viewers. And we would like to be able to invite you on from time to time in the future as events develop.
I would love to do that. It was very nice having this discussion with you. And I also want to mention, and you and I had talked about this before we went on air tonight.
Yes.
Because I get a lot of, you know, very concerned people that may just hear about this for the first time and they live in some of the areas that we talked about, or if they work for the airline industry and, you know, they're symptomatic, they need to take this more seriously than someone who isn't. And for somebody who lives in an area where we know that the levels have been high, you know, I'll get emails from people saying, should I move? Like they're very concerned when they find out the first time. And I think that it is possible to live in these environments if you're doing the right things and you're avoiding the bad things like precipitation, because many people were able to do that after Chernobyl. And so the question really becomes, the first question is, how are you feeling? And if you're having symptoms, then you do need to look into this with more of a sense of urgency than you would otherwise.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for those insights. And we look forward to having you be on our program again.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Good night.
Bye.